Welcome to the Fantasy Football Forge. It is the weekend. My name is Steve, but I don't want to take up too much of your time today, so we're going to really jump right into today's topic. The research never stops. What we are looking at today is ADP risers and fallers over roughly the past month. What you're looking at right now is a sheet that I'm not really going to go over. I just don't want to spoil the rest of the video, but this is the base sheet where I took the ADPs off of Fantasy Pro's website, like I said, about a month ago, and then I've compared them to the most recent ADPs as of this video's, as of 3 or 4 days ago. So originally I was gonna maybe do a video every week. There just weren't too many massive changes over the period of a week a month ago, but now it's been a month. There has been a lot of changes, and what's really interesting is seeing some big differences across positions and how that has impacted how the draft is going to go. We will be looking at the quarterbacks, wide receivers, running backs, and the tight ends. So let's start off with the quarterbacks. And as a whole, my big observation for the quarterbacks was that the top end of the position keeps going higher. There seems to be a bit of a scramble to get a couple of those top end guys. Not necessarily all of them right at the top, a couple of names that I will point out. Meanwhile, some of the mid-tier guys are going much, much later in the draft, which I think is increasing their value. And if you're someone like me who, especially in the second round, is not going to be grabbing a quarterback, then that should be a little bit exciting. And you can see that right on the screen right now. Let me explain every page that you're going to look at. When you see the guys all in red, I didn't want to remove them from the chart, but those are guys who their ranking is post top 200, which would be outside of a typical 16 rounds. That gets you to I think a 190 people that would be drafted in a draft. So after the top 200, I went and I highlighted each of those players in full red just so we can see who's really not even being drafted. We'll look at those guys a couple of times, at least in one position. But when looking at these kind of mid-tier guys that I'm talking about, seeing them fall back, here you can see the average ADP in that most rightward column that I have highlighted. In the orange, just because it's not a good thing for their ADP, this negative number means that they are going later in the draft. Names like Derek Carr, Matt Stafford, Russell Wilson, Jordan Love, Jared Goff, Kirk Cousins, Trey Lance, Geno Smith, Daniel Jones, Anthony Richardson all make the top 10. When you look at where they're ranked, it's a lot of those names that you're finding in the end of kind of the higher end mid-tier and then onto some of the early back-end tiers. And I find Matt Stafford, that's surprising to me. I don't think that his ADP should be any lower than, sorry, I got a phone call, than what it should. I mean, I've pushed him up in my rankings, but as you can see, the position as a whole is just getting pushed back, but not the top end guys. When we go down and we look, I didn't even highlight any of these because there's only really 3 draftable guys who have seen big increases in their ADP are going higher. Brock Purdy makes sense. CJ Stroud, I guess that makes sense. Rookie quarterback, maybe some more and more confidence will build as the offseason builds. Mac Jones makes sense. I think he is a guy who's easy to underappreciate, I guess. Dak Prescott, I agree with him moving up. So now you'll see some higher numbers here. Look at this. Patrick Mahomes ADP increasing by a little bit. Joe Burrow, Lamar Jackson increasing by a little bit. And then Trevor Lawrence also being moved up a little bit in drafts. I don't disagree, especially with Trevor Lawrence here being pushed up, but just find it interesting that a couple of these big names are getting pushed up. Meanwhile, those guys that go after the Tua Tagovailoa essentially in the draft are starting to be pushed back. Deshaun Watson getting pushed back a little ways. But yeah, there you can see where they are. You want some of those later round guys. Matt Stafford could be a great value to point out the biggest one. Kirk Cousins. They're becoming, I'd say, really good buys at this point in time. So those are the observations on the quarterback position. That moves us to the wide receiver trends. So once again, it's the same chart here. You are seeing the difference in the ADP from a month ago. Are they going higher or lower? Lower is going to be negative. Have it organized in the same order as the previous chart. Joshua Palmer going much, much later than he was going at one point in time. I don't know why he was ever going too high, but obviously pre-draft, I could see it a little bit, but it doesn't matter. He's an undrafted guy. Chase Claypool pretty much going undrafted. So wide receiver position as a whole. Very interesting dynamics here going on. We are seeing the position on a whole get drafted later. Let me show you. You can see all these. The first guy, Khalil Shakur, has the same ADP as he did a month ago. It would be the 89th wide receiver of this group. There are what? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Like less than 15 guys who are actually going higher in ADP. Almost all of there's 2 guys that are being drafted whose ADP at the wide receiver position has actually risen over the past month. Other than that, every other wide receiver who gets drafted regularly in a 16-round draft is going lower than they were a month ago. Totally interesting. And one thing that I noticed for the biggest of the guys who are going back later in their drafts are going to be a lot of these wide receivers from like the 7th round or later. Are going to be a lot of the names that we're going to see here in this top 10 list of the guys being drafted. And to be honest, this makes sense to me because as of like a month ago or a little bit earlier, more than a month ago, I was really, really surprised as I started following the drafts, looking at the trends of the draft, at how early and how often wide receivers were going. I think if you were to look at my first best ball mock draft, I'd probably make a comment about that. That said, this trend for the wide receivers, just like I was surprised at how late you could get a lot of running backs, I expect to see that the running backs have had essentially the exact opposite effect that we have seen here. Obviously, now I know if that's the truth or not, but I did make that notation before we got to the running backs, just a little self-credit in case I'm correct. So, top 10 guys who have fallen in drafts via their ADP. Zay Jones going about 35 spots later on average. Jacoby Myers, Tyler Boyd, KJ Osborne, Courtland Sutton. So, Zay Jones, somebody who I definitely agree with. I'm not too excited about getting him. I think he's one of those guys where if there's an injury, especially if it's not early in the season, you'll probably be able to find him on most waiver wires, and then he'll have a lot of value. But I just think that there are too many targets, and he's like the 4th guy on the target chart, so he's going to be incredibly unpredictable. As much as I like that offense and everything, that I'm not targeting him at all. Unless it comes to the point where I think he's a value, which there is a point where he is draftable, that's for sure. Jacoby Myers just moved down in my rankings a little bit. I was high on him. It looks like he's moved down an average ADP quite a ways as well. I still think that there's some sneaky upside to Jacoby Myers, and that could also be related to some of the concerns over the past month with Jimmy Garoppolo, which I told you not to be worried about. And if you haven't heard the news, it's a nothing burger for the most part at this point. Make sure he doesn't get injured, nothing comes up in camp, but that's the truth for everybody at this point in the year. Tyler Boyd, it's the same thing as Zay Jones. Very hard to predict which weeks he'll go off. KJ Osborne, totally agree with him falling. I thought he was going way too high. Never quite understood that. Courtland Sutton falling down. I moved him back in my rankings. I already had him higher, though, than most people. I still think there's some sneaky upside to Courtland Sutton, especially at least early on in the season as Marvin Mims, who's getting a late start in training camp, gets his feet under him. And until that point, I think Marvin Mims might not even be the replacement for Courtland Sutton. It might even be Tim. We'll see. He's one of the names who's on the risers list, so we'll get to that. Quentin Johnson moving back. I agree with that. It's some sort of prediction for this offense, although we can expect it to look different than last year, so there should be more 3 wide receiver sets. But still, there's enough question marks that I think he was going too high. And I think now I've even taken him in a draft, so he's becoming much more normalized. Sky Moore, I agree with him falling back. Darnell Mooney, I don't agree with him. I think he was already getting drafted pretty late. So surprising a little bit to see him going back even further. Juju Smith-Schuster, Zay Flowers at the bottom of this list, and Juju has some injury concerns that he still hasn't gotten over coming into the season. The moment the green light is given for Juju prior to the season starting, I think you should be a little bit more willing to draft him, and I just think in general he might be getting a little underappreciated. Could just be a really solid wide receiver 3-4 kind of guy for your team. And then Zay Flowers, I agree. I think he's been going too high. There's just a lot of wide receivers there, a lot of question marks with those wide receivers. New system. A lot of things going on there. So then we get to the ADP risers, which, as I mentioned, are dominated by a bunch of names that are still technically going to go undrafted in a 16-round draft. That said, this list of names clearly has a lot of names who you may be hearing if you were listening to experts. A lot of names who have had some hype given to them as of late. So I think this list makes a lot of sense. And I agree with all of these names being taken higher, being draftable guys, except for, I think, 3 of them here. Justin Ross for Kansas City, right? I don't think I have that wrong. I just don't see it happening. I know he's been getting some hype as of late. I'm not on that train. Tank Dell, I have too much confidence in some of the other receivers there. I think it's hard. He's going to be, even in his best days, unless he is, I don't know, Tyreek Hill or something, I think he's still going to be a boom or bust kind of guy. And in a rookie season on that team, I don't think I want boom or bust. And then the other one I'm on the fence with, like, I want to change my opinion on him because I really did like him coming out of college, is Paris Campbell. I don't think he makes the starting, like, top 3 wide receivers for that team. But if he is the slot wide receiver to start the season, there's going to be some definite upside there. I'm just not on that fence, on that side of the fence, but I am on the fence a little bit with Paris Campbell. Other than that, though, Khalil Shakur, I think, could be a surprise. Van Jefferson could definitely be, I guess, all of these guys technically a surprise since they're going undrafted, but Van Jefferson, Jaden Reed, Jalen Hyatt, Michael Wilson, Wan'Dale Robinson, Puka Nacua, Devontae Parker, Tim Patrick, it's the other Broncos wide receiver who I was trying to think of his name of, all guys who I think could be very much fantasy assets on the back ends of your rosters, and even maybe a little bit more than that. The only names here, Tyler Lockett, Greg Dulcich, who's not a wide receiver. I screwed up on getting him into the tight ends. My bad on Greg Dulcich. Yep. Well, there's an error. So Tyler Lockett's the only wide receiver whose ADP has risen by an almost negligible amount. And I guess the tight ends won't have Greg Dulcich in them. My bad. Moving on to the running backs, right off of the bat, ADP fallers are a bunch of speculative names from earlier on in the draft season. Guys like Sean Tucker, Matt Breida, Travion Williams, Isaiah Spiller, Eric Gray. Eric Gray is the name who I wouldn't be totally opposed to taking at the end of the draft. There's a chance that he could be the guy if Saquon Barkley gets injured. Deneric Prince never got that one. Malik Davis, I think same boat as Eric Gray, but a little more guaranteed for him that he's, I think, the guy if Tony Pollard goes down. But none of those guys have been receiving buzz, so it makes sense that their ADPs have fallen over the last month and a half. That said, I feel a little bit differently about these guys who are going drafted, whose ADPs have fallen. I think it's a mistake to overly underestimate the value of these guys. Kenneth Gainwell, I mean, we don't know who the starter is for Philadelphia yet. And if anybody goes down, and there's 2 very injury-prone guys in the way, he could immediately become a great value as well. So I just don't overlook guys like Kenneth Gainwell. Tank Bigsby could have a role, and, of course, because of injury, could be one of the top, become a running back too. Leonard Fournette's really the only name that I'm not, unless I'm in 0 RB or something, drafting around this early, or, we'll see if he ends up going somewhere. But for now, unless it's 0 RB, it's not really a big enough risk where there's a lot of names for running backs that I think are still on the board late that I would rather just grab, who I'm a little bit more sure of the situation. Roshan Johnson, I don't think that should be overlooked. He could technically still become the starter or become the starter a few weeks into the season. Anything goes with that Chicago backfield, I think. Zach Charbonnet, Kendre Miller. Zach Charbonnet is a guy who I've warmed up to, so I might have been part of his ADP falling, but both guys with talent and potential opportunities ahead of them that should not be ignored. So a little bit surprised to see this list of names that are falling. Maybe not surprised about Kenny Gainwell. Leonard Fournette, I guess, wouldn't be a surprise from like a month and a half ago either. The big thing here, as expected, we are seeing a very opposite effect happening with the position as a whole. So we are seeing a lot of guys, just this group of 19 guys who have seen their ADPs fall, However, then there's a group of roughly 70 more running backs whose ADPs have been rising over the past month and a half. So just the exact opposite of the wide receivers. And so out of the names of guys who are still going undrafted, but their value has been rising, I mostly think that the players out of this who you should most entertain at the back end of drafts would be Josh Kelly, kind of. He didn't actually make this list that I wrote out, but Zamir White, not Zach Moss, not Ty Chandler, not Evan Hull, Pierre Strong Jr., Deuce Vaughn, not necessarily Dwayne McBride either, and, okay, I did right, and Josh Kelly. So Josh Kelly, Pierre Strong, Deuce Vaughn, Zamir White, all guys who I think definitely should be entertained at the back end of drafts. As far as the top 10 guys being drafted higher, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, I agree with that. I've always had him much higher than ADP, and I don't know about expert consensus. Cordero Patterson, I agree. I think there's going to be a role for all of these running backs there in Atlanta. Not necessarily a guy I want to draft, though. I don't think the role's ever going to be enough, especially with 3 running backs, I think, taking part in that backfield, for him to be fantasy relevant. And if there's an injury, there's going to need to be 2 injuries ahead of him before he even has a chance at being the starter. And even then, they might use somebody else as their main guy to go up the middle. Michael Carter rising in drafts. I don't understand that. Alvin Kamara rising in drafts. That would make sense. Tyjae Spears. Yeah, he's received a fair amount of buzz. That makes sense. I don't disagree with any of these guys except for Michael Carter. And Cordell Patterson maybe is just a guy who I just don't see the ceiling for. Jerome Ford makes sense. Rashad Penny, it makes sense that he's been rising. There's more and more chatter around. We don't know the starter there. They got this new shiny new toy, but he's kind of a receiving back. He definitely might not be the main first, second down kind of guy. Miles Sanders, I think same thing. People are warming up to the opportunity that he's going to get is great. So I agree with this. Ezekiel Elliott, a little bit surprising he's up on this list, but okay. Alexander Madison, obviously, and maybe based on, I don't know how long their ADPs take to adjust. Maybe that's going up even a little bit more. It'd be surprising that he's only 12 and a half more spots ahead of where he had been going a month and a half ago. Well, he went from a backup running back to being the starter. But yeah, don't agree with Ezekiel Elliott. Another couple of names here. James Conn are moving up. Dameon Pierce, Jamal Williams, J.K. Dobbins. We'll see. I think J.K. Dobbins will start to fall. Things with that, I don't know what to do with the Ravens backfield as of now with the most recent news. It's just not looking pretty. Just so unfortunate for guys who I really like. I really like the team. But let's move on to the tight end position. And interestingly, this kind of coincided with the quarterbacks and some of, just like the running backs and the wide receivers. Right at the top of the list, falling 25 spots, is Tyler Higbee. Totally disagree with that as far as just on a whole. Maybe not necessarily with where he's getting taken in a draft. So that's about 12... Around round 13 or something is where his ranking is. So I can't necessarily disagree with him being around 13 guy. If he's now being taken behind some other tight ends, I don't necessarily agree with that. Mike Gesicki, I agree with. Dawson Knox, I can agree with. Trey McBride, I agree with him going undrafted. Juwan Johnson, I agree with his ADP falling. Gerald Everett. This is kind of in the same boat with Tyler Higbee. Maybe I don't necessarily disagree with where they're going in a draft, but it is surprising if they're being pushed back against other tight ends, which this is not exactly representing here. Then that would be a little bit surprising. I think, I don't really like him a whole lot this season, but my opinion on him hasn't changed. And nothing's really changed around that situation in the last month. Irv Smith Jr. falling back, I can agree with that. Hayden Hurst, I can generally agree with those guys, though. Jelani Woods, Isaiah Likely, I agree with these names. Dalton Schultz is a name, been sliding back a little bit. Don't sleep on that. He's probably going to be a worthy tight end, although I don't feel super comfortable with him either, so I understand it. But here's where we get to something very interesting with the tight ends. As a whole, it appears that the targets, the second/third tier type of tight ends, are rising, and they are going higher in drafts. So the interactions between the tight ends and the quarterback, it's not as clear cut as the running back wide receiver interactions, but I think you can make some inferrals as to just how the draft is changing. But in general, the big thing here is that the tight ends are going higher than they were a month and a half ago overall, especially amongst not the highest end of your tight ends, not the Mark Andrews necessarily, although they are going on a whole a little bit higher. Mark Andrews, where are you? Travis Kelce actually going a little bit lower, which I would agree with. We'll get to that in a moment. So the top 10 guys are Taysom Hill has moved up the most. I don't understand that. Zach Ertz has moved up quite a bit. I can understand that. I had him. He did very, very, very well last season before his injury with Arizona. So if he could be back to full health, there's a very good opportunity. Let's say this. I would not be shocked if he is a top 12 tight end. I would be surprised, not shocked. Then Kadon and Luke Musgrave moving up the charts. I agree with that full-heartedly. I think that they are draft worthy, depending on your team makeup. Darren Waller, Pat Freiermuth, Michael Mayer. I don't agree with that. He's not a guy I want to target. Hunter Henry, don't agree with that. Dallas Goedert moving up. Evan Ingram, George Kittle, Kyle Pitts, all just getting pushed up a little bit higher. Do with that information what you must, but that is what it's looking like. So to me, that just means, whereas I maybe used to be very happy with where I'm getting, I'll say a name like George Kittle. He used to seem like, oh, okay, I get him late 5th round, early 6th round. That doesn't feel too bad for George Kittle. And so even though I wasn't even that high on him, but now it's getting back to a point where it's like, okay, well, I have guys ranked very close to him, or like Kyle Pitts higher than him, who I can take behind him. So there you go. That's what the position looks like. Couple of tight ends. First of all, Mark Andrews, of note, is going higher here. A little bit higher, but he, goes early in the draft, so you expect those movements to be a little bit smaller typically for some of those higher. Like the guy that's taken first overall in the draft can only go in one direction. This is an impact that I have noticed when doing drafts over the past month, where it used to be for Mark Andrews that he would probably go 3rd round and might even make it into the early portion of the 4th round. That's really no longer a reality. Now it's more like he's going late 2nd round a fair bit, or almost guaranteed in the early 3rd round, and you get really lucky if he's still there in the late 3rd round. So he has moved up, and that has been felt, and I really liked the value with him when his ADP was a little bit lower. Is starting to get into an area of the draft where I am less likely to take him, although when you're right at the end of the 2nd round, you're coming around in just a couple of picks, it still works. But once he gets into the mid portions of the 2nd round, it's going to be a guy who I'm probably less likely to get. The same here can be said for this Travis Kelce conundrum. We're going to finish off talking about Travis Kelce and what my thoughts are about drafting him. And I have this weird conundrum with Travis Kelce where I would almost want to take him earlier than later, even though I think he's getting taken too high. And that's because of how the draft tends to go. What players are going to be available for you in the 3rd round? If you take Travis Kelce with a late pick, then you come around, you get a running back early 2nd round. By the time that you get your pick in the late 3rd round, both positions, whether you went quarterback, or running back, or wide receiver with your 2nd pick, there are tiers that end that don't typically make it into the late portion of the 3rd round for the wide receiver and the running back that I think you're just giving up too much on by getting that tight end position filled up early with Travis Kelce in the 1st round. However, if you take Travis Kelce with a mid-round, pick 5, let's say, and that's not a totally random number, then when you're coming back around in the 3rd round, a lot of times there's going to be a few names. So if you're a big believer in guys like Chris Olave, T. Higgins, and Devonta Smith, you could go tight end, get one of the top running backs still in the middle portion of the running 2nd round. And then in the 3rd round, you could still get one of my top 12 guys. Olave, I don't have Higgins and Devonta Smith quite in the top 12, but you can come back and get one of those guys if you are thinking that they're top 12 kinds of guys. So that's my conundrum with them is, well, I guess here's my conundrum with him. I also have too many guys to take him prior to even thinking about taking him until maybe like pick 9 at the earliest. There is, let's see, I have the top 8 players via ADP currently. I'm taking over Travis Kelce. I'm not taking Travis Kelce over them. So I can't take him at pick 5 like I think could work strategically, just because I don't see the value in him over them. And then he's not making it to you in the late first round, but if he does, I would pass up on him. Maybe take him then in the second round, and you could get a running back in the third round if you took a wide receiver in the first. That could work, but then he's really got to fall much, much farther back than where he's currently still going at, looks like ADP of 5-ish. I don't know. He's ranked 5th, so he has the 5th highest ADP. I don't know. The rankings on Fantasy Pros are a little weird. So that's my Travis Kelce conundrum. Strategically, I would take him where he's going roughly in drafts, because you can come back around 2 rounds later and still catch the tail end of the wide receivers, where I don't think you're going to be missing out on a whole lot. You'll be missing out on a little bit, but not a whole lot. But then where I would take him potentially at the earliest, strategically, I no longer want him because I feel like I'm missing out on too much from both the wide receivers and the running backs, whereas I just don't like what my overall team looks like when I take him at pick 10 or something. So there you go. Those are the ADP risers and fallers. I hope you were able to take something away from this video, and I hope that I made that Travis Kelce statement argument make some sense. So thank you very much for joining me. Enjoy the rest of your weekend or day, whatever day it is that you're coming across this video. And I think I will do another ADP's risers, fallers before leaning into Labor Day weekend, because it was really interesting to see how drafts have been changing. I think that would be good information to have going into a draft, to see a target of yours. Maybe you see a tight end target of yours who's going even later now than they have been. And if that trend were to continue, maybe you can push your luck with them in the 13th, 14th round, wait till the 15th, 16th round to take them. Or if the opposite is true and their ADP is rising, maybe you'll know, okay, I need to take them in like that 12th, 13th round in order to secure him, because it looks like other people are onto this guy that I like so much. So once again, peace out. Goodbye. Thank you very much. Let's go.